How many of you here today identify as a planner? As an architect? You have to pick one, I guess. As an architect, as a landscape architect. You can pick more than one. I didn't say that. Nobody's a landscape architect. Urbanist, broadly defined. Social scientist? Engineer. Okay, now, any of you who identify as more than one of those professions, please wave at me. That's great. We have in this room a group of interdisciplinarians, I think. And that means that the work that I'm going to show you today, I hope, has some resonance and traction beyond the discipline with which you may have first identified, because that is what is needed for us going forward. I'm going to talk today about projects in Toronto, a city in which I live and work, that has some resonance and some connection with Stockholm, not least of which I would say is because we are northern cities, northern defined by our climate, defined also by a relationship to landscape that is not dissimilar, and perhaps increasingly defined by a changing socio-ecological set of relationships. We are cities of immigration, we are cities that are not in biodiversity hotspots necessarily, but we have a relationship with our landscapes that is part of our identities, one might say, and it's also changing. And with that, I thought it was useful to think about the ways in which our cities, and I'm speaking specifically about Toronto, but also in my relationship with Stockholm and with other Nordic cities, some of us are experimenting with leading our planning with landscape. And that makes us a little bit different. It may mean that we make mistakes sometimes in leading with landscape. It also may offer opportunities to rethink the way we invest in our infrastructures. And that is the purpose of today's talk, which I hope will provoke a useful discussion. I'll try to speak for just under an hour, which will leave us time for discussion. Please, if you need to leave, don't hesitate to get up, that's fine. This is a lecture to provoke conversation. So I want to speak about leading with landscape, and in particular to demonstrate design solutions that are intended to show investments in green infrastructure. Why? Because I'll talk a little bit about, in a very broad way, the framework of resilience. I won't speak about the science of socio-ecological resilience. I was here last year speaking about that, and there are many of your colleagues who are expert in this, particularly in the Stockholm area, both at this institution and others. I would like to just say that this work builds on a trajectory of work in resilience that I've been undertaking for the last 20 years, but specifically in urban resilience, urban ecological resilience, for about the last 10. And you can see some of this work that's covered in professional design magazines like Topos and others, and also editorial reviewed commentary, as well as a more recent publication that came out on Nature and Cities. Of course, some of the work we do is connected with the 100 Resilient Cities movement that is sponsored by the Rockefeller Foundation. Many of you will know some of this work. Is Stockholm a resilient city? I believe it is, but I'm not sure. Anyone can confirm that? The resilient cities are, of course, funded by the Rockefeller Foundation, and this movement opened up some question as to what really we meant by resilience. If you're funding a resilience officer in a city to promote resilience, what does this mean? And for me, this was a year-long study that contemplated what really it meant. And resilience, the upshot of that research was that resilience is more than just bouncing back to normal and getting the lights put on, even though that is a lot of what gets translated into popular media. That resilience is about moving to a place where we get back to normal as quickly as possible without fundamentally challenging whether the normal is the same state that was problematic in the first place. So a lot of the research that we're doing right now looks at transformative capacity, adaptive capacity of living systems to change under duress, stress, changing climate, loss of biodiversity, and so on. That the normals we are moving to are different, they're new. And of course, that is the underpinning of much of the discussion of resilience that is beyond my topic for today, but gives some framework to it. I would also say that in the last 2 years, we've seen changes happen at the global level, particularly in Habitat 3, which was in Quito, I think 2 years ago now. For the first time, we saw global leaders recognize that biodiversity was an essential component of cities. Last year, Richard Weller out of the University of Pennsylvania and Karen Cito at the Cito Lab at Yale combined their research and data to show that urbanizing regions in the world's urban biodiversity hotspots were on a direct collision course. That is to say, as our cities grow quickly, they grow most quickly in the areas that are most biodiverse. And therefore, we will have direct and regular conflicts with the need to protect the biodiversity that sustains us and the cities in which we live. That's not really Toronto's problem or Stockholm's problem purely on the basis of biodiversity, but it is a global problem. And where we might learn from one another is we have a robust landscape that sustains our cities already, and they're under pressure. Whether or not they're biodiversity hotspots is not so much the point, but rather that we too are growing into and around our biodiversity, and we're finding ways to think about resilience through landscape. The New Urban Agenda was a catalyst for some of this research, and the recognition, of course, that our settlements are changing quickly. As we head towards 8.5 billion on the planet, the cities in which are the greatest numbers are getting even bigger. And our cities, of course, will be the recipients of more migration, immigration, and settlement as some areas of the world, particularly coastal regions, become uninhabitable or less habitable. So we can only expect increased pressures on our landscapes, increased challenges to the way we move around the city, and some research questions that we can focus on have to do with this. The first is to say that the research I'm doing is clear that resilient and adaptive systems are connected systems. Landscapes are connected. They're not isolated patches. They're movement corridors for various forms of life, plants as well as those non-sessile creatures, plants as well as birds, mammals, fish, and people. They're connected. So then how do we reconnect our cities to the very nature that sustains us? That's a very broad question. It's more of a problem than a question. And at the bottom, how do we plan for urban biodiversity? That's the initiative of Habitat 3 in the New Urban Agenda. It's also clearly connected to resilient systems. We could add to this climate change, but because climate and biodiversity are so strongly connected, correlated, we're really looking here at green vegetation as a habitat basis for cities, and I'll explain that more in just a moment. The blue and green infrastructure that you sometimes hear referenced, notice I've added blue here because sometimes water-based living systems are as important to a city as their green vegetation-based landscapes. We could put them together to say, these are a kind of infrastructure. Just as the way our roads, rails, bridges, pipelines, and sewers are gray infrastructure, these types of living, purpose-designed infrastructure are also worthy of civic investment. So the thesis for this lecture is that we lead with landscape. If we plan our cities for resilience, and particularly focused on the link between climate and biodiversity, they need connections. They need strong connections to landscape. And in our cities, increasingly, these will be purpose-built. They will be designed infrastructures that are designed to host, form, and shape landscape functions. Also from a social perspective, we can talk more about that as we go through these. You'll see these infrastructures have at their heart the need to make places for people as well as other species. Sometimes those are in conflict and tension. Blue and green infrastructure can do two very broad classes of things. It can slow, hold, and clean water in a very broad way. That is to say, our designed landscape infrastructure in cities can be used for stormwater filtration, holding, slowing, infiltration, and cleaning. They can also, through vegetation, sometimes even underwater, they can create, connect, and protect habitats. That's a platform for urban biodiversity. Interestingly enough, when infrastructures that we design do this, they can also be performative for people. Not always at the same time. And sometimes they're connecting purpose-built infrastructure with more naturalized infrastructure. But in all cases, we're talking about the landscape itself as a kind of a civic infrastructure worthy of investment, the same way we build capital budgets for pipelines, roads, rails, and bridges, or sewers. So these we're talking about in this lecture are connected networks of landscape. In the Toronto context that I'll use to illustrate examples, they are parks, ravines, rivers, and waterfronts. They are also alive. That is to say, the infrastructure itself is a kind of living surface. And in that respect, when I refer to landscape as infrastructure, this is a kind of investment in water and land. Notice that I'm saying vegetation cover. Now, I'm not specifying native vegetation or non-native, but rather a broad class of vegetation that at this moment, while we may wish for it to be as native as possible for its own resilience, increasingly as our climate shifts, the gradients, particularly from the equator north into our climates, are shifting and changing the kinds of vegetation we will see. So it's less than ideal to say they must be native, because it will very soon beg the question, what is native? We might more realistically and practically say naturalizing vegetation, some of which is desirable and some of which is not. So please understand that there are, of course, a number of questions that have to do with social and cultural policy and have to do with scientific research embedded in these statements. I recognize that, and I ask a little bit for your indulgence that I'm speaking at a fairly high level here at this point. I'm also recognizing that we need partnerships to work with experts, ecologists, hydrologists, engineers, geomorphologists in some cases, plant botanists, people who are expert in each of these fields so that we can determine what kinds of vegetation in what place we're talking about. So here, for the moment, it's fairly broad. The other point to make about landscape as a kind of infrastructural investment is that it's scalable. We can be talking about site-based infrastructure, things like parks, purpose-built parks, beyond just recreational parks. They can be at the level of the precinct or the neighborhood. They can be connections between parks. But most of all, these ought to be regional frameworks that at a more fine-grained resolution have really tangible design solutions. They may be designed in policy, but they ought also to be designed in practice. So there's always a connection between the regional framework that supports these kinds of infrastructural solutions and the actual commissioning of the solutions themselves, the interventions, the design interventions that those of you who are architects and landscape architects would work on. Planners are concerned with the design of policy that would create these regional frameworks. And some cities have strong regional governments. I don't believe that Stockholm or Toronto are really those cities. I think we have very strong regional guidelines, but whether or not these are enforceable legislative mechanisms there's some debate about. Landscape infrastructure is also multifunctional. It has many benefits, from ecosystem services that we might say are performative ecologically, from food provision to pollination to oxygenation to water cleaning to recreation, more social benefits, but they are also have the potential for a biophilic connection. That is to say, to tap into that which is in every one of us, a kind of pre-adaptation, a connection to nature, something we call nature. Most human beings we know benefit, human beings in general benefit from exposure to what we call nature, green vegetation. We can specify what kind maybe later in some discussion. But we know there's good evidence for stress reduction, physical, measurable, empirical evidence for stress reduction, attention and focus increase. More research more recently shows compassion. Imagine that, compassion increases with 15 minutes of exposure to green vegetation. These are relatively recent social scientific studies, but the point is that the benefits of green infrastructure lie well beyond just their performance value in slowing water or thickening the biodiversity. There are benefits directly to human beings, to say nothing, of course, of individual cultures, spiritual connections to ideas about nature. Landscape as an infrastructure is necessarily going to be interjurisdictional. Landscapes that are connected run through different jurisdictional boundaries, so the opportunity for collaboration and conflict between planning and policy professionals is obvious, as is the need for transdisciplinary research. When I say that they are performative, I would also emphasize that landscape infrastructures are often hybrid. They are a connection between a naturalized area, potentially at grade, and some purpose-built, engineered infrastructural connection between those areas on the ground. Bridges between parks, for example. Green corridors or eco-passages between community networks of green space. Above all else, I would emphasize that an investment in landscape-based infrastructure is a step towards building a sustainable and resilient city, sure, but it ought also, from a civic perspective, to be beautiful, to be aesthetically desirable so that people foster and care for these infrastructures. But most of all, while they are pragmatic, they ought also to be poetic. And from an architectural point of view, that's really important. It is how we get things built. I'd like to talk about some good and bad lessons from Toronto. I won't necessarily characterize them as that. I'll allow you to make some assertions yourself in evaluations as looking at these. By no means would I suggest that this is a classification of what works. It's what's being done, and it needs evaluation. But it is an interesting approach because what you will see is an example of a city that has made cash and capital investments in landscape before it has made them in architecture. And that's an unusual strategy, partly because it's a city where we can do that in terms of its size and landscape potential. But it has not been easy, and it is not without some challenges. And we don't really know if it works yet. We know it works in certain respects. So this is an aerial view looking south to the Great Lake of Lake Ontario through the city of Toronto. In its urban core, close to 3 million, in the greater area about 5 million people, and you're looking down one of the 3 major river ravines towards the lake. And you can see the relationship in this summer image, of course it's a summer image, to the city itself. The city is also a waterfront city, and this landform that juts out about 8 kilometers into Lake Ontario from the northern shore of the city is a conservation area. It's an amazing bird staging area on the lake. It's entirely human built. It is the infill, it is the deposited clean landfill that resulted from the excavations of downtown towers. And it was built over the course of 20 years. This is where they put the fill when they dug the foundations for the towers in the city. People think of it as a natural landscape. It begs the question what natural is, but it is certainly a piece of landscape infrastructure. In the city, we have identified a number of connections that are already existing. Some have called Toronto the accidental city of the way it's referred to as a park within a city. Or a city within a park, rather. It is called the city within a park. And these connections are in some ways accidental because the green strands that you see on the screen here are river ravines leading to the lake that were protected so that they would not cause and exacerbate flooding. A major storm event in the 1950s caused the protection of these valleyways, a little bit like, sort of comparable to Stockholm's green wedges. Not exactly the same, but there is a similarity here. So as the city grew, it's only now growing, chewing at the wedges, I believe, and as Hannah has written in her work. In Toronto, we can't chew at the edges of the ravines because they're steep, and I'll show some images of them. But this is a very broad-based diagram of the connections that are possible in an area that from east to west here, left to right, rather west to east, left to right, spans about 30 kilometers. And in the inside of the city, in the downtown core, on the lakefront, between the shore and the islands, there is another big loop of connections between green spaces. So this is a very broad-based image of the landscape infrastructure. There are a number of policies in place, and they don't always work nicely together. No one is particularly in charge here. These are policies that work sometimes in overlap, sometimes with a little bit of tension between them. But they include, for example, North America's first zoning bylaw requiring green roofs. Not innovative in Europe, but in North America, the first initiative for commercial institutional buildings. Toronto Green Standard that sets the framework, regulatory and advisory, for green buildings, for mid to high-rise residential and non-residential or commercial development. We have a parks and forestry policy for green canopy cover of trees. We have a policy that is actually a set of guidelines about how stormwater is to be managed. None of these supersedes the other. We also have an official plan that sets the vision for the city that works in tandem with zoning bylaws. So this agglomeration is really a mosaic of strategies we can use to advance green infrastructure. We don't always use any of them in some places of the city other than the official plan. As a waterfront city, our city has for the last 30 years been studying contamination on the Great Lakes, in particular in Toronto, which is one of many areas which were called remedial action areas, remedial action plan areas. Over the course of development in the 20th century, the ports and harbors became contaminated. This would not be a surprise to you as a shipping city. And since the decline of manufacturing and the move towards a more knowledge-based economy, we've seen these areas stagnate. And for the last 20 years, the Waterfront has been undertaking a revitalization strategy. It's one of the largest such revitalization strategies in the world, and for a city of our size, that's somewhat remarkable. And it is a way to accommodate growth. We have now a city where 57% of our population, approximately, in Toronto is born outside the country. So when you wonder who the majority is, the majority are people who are born outside the country. So there's a very fresh and changing set of perspectives in the city. And this area on the waterfront is where many newcomers will be housed and where many of our young people will eventually relocate. And they will relocate in housing that is very different than that of their parents. Toronto is an underzoned city. It's a city of many single detached homes or row houses. Now we are moving up. And this area, as it's redeveloped, will become home to approximately in the right-hand side of the screen, more than 80,000 people in the next 10 years. So there's real change happening in this space. And we think of this as the second wave of development on our waterfront. It is funded by our federal government, the provincial government, and the city. And I want to hop through it, if you will, and a kind of a design tour of the nature-based or landscape-based solutions that are building this area out. They are not being designed specifically as standalone or isolated parks, but rather as a connected system of landscapes that will host the next generation of our city dwellers. They are in part capitalizing on existing local parks, but also making new destination parks as the entire riverfront and lakefront are designed together. The areas highlighted in green show you some of those. In light green are areas that are new and changing or being reformed. Areas that are in dark green are existing areas that are more naturalized, that in some cases are going to have design interventions that connect them to the light green. Along the waterfront, there has already been 20 years of investment in the creation of public parks. And these are really not parks that were designed for anything other than human enjoyment, recreation, respite, relaxation, the kinds of things we think of our traditional parks as doing. But many of them are iconic investments. They have a particular aesthetic to them. This one, Sugar Beach by Claude Cormier, paysagiste in Montreal. Sugar Beach is a water park, but it is also a park that hosts a number of playgrounds. This is Corktown Common. I'll just show you some of them so you get a flavor of what these new parks are like. They represent a significant investment, but they're largely still recreational parks. The one exception is that Corktown Common, shown above, has a remarkable collection of species that are native and required a rethinking of the way the city manages its parks, because it was literally designed to create enjoyment for humans, but also as a form of flood management, water retention and holding, and urban biodiversity. So it is a very different planting palette and a very different approach to the way a city park has been designed. These parks along the waterfront, on the right-hand side of the screen, we're looking at Corktown Common's Iris Garden, Stormwater Garden. This is part of the flood protection berm that protects this area of the city from flooding by the river. And on the left-hand side is what looks to most people like a pleasant water feature. It's pretty, it has daylilies in it, or rather blue flag iris in it. It is actually a stormwater infiltration and cleaning swale that takes water from a series of parks back to the lake. In fact, it represents also a challenge to the city. This park was budgeted to be a naturalized, nature-based solution to stormwater overland flow. And city engineers and city parks people are in two different departments. And the city engineers did not have confidence that green vegetation would do the job, that could treat the surface waste, and this is principally E. coli bacteria from dog parks and from people in the park. It's being treated, the water is treated before it returns to the lake. And so what they did was insist that the development add on a UV filtration system underground. So this is an example of a nature-based solution, a piece of green infrastructure that was designed to do a job for which some would say it could. The engineering department had never approved one of these and wanted to make sure it would work. And so an additional significant investment was required to build a UV treatment plant. One wonders whether that's necessary. So we don't always have confidence in these designs. The art sculptures at the back are by Jill Anholt. They're part of the park's appeal. And it is also an architecturally significant park. It has a pavilion, very beautiful pavilion designed by Steve Teeple, and a skating rink in the winter or a pond in the summer. So these can be several things at once. Sugar Beach is not just a summer playground. It's a little bit of an irony maybe to look at the pink umbrellas in the winter, but they have become a kind of iconic feature along the waterfront where they're now recognizable. People know where they are along the waterfront trail through Claude's pink umbrellas. The major piece of investment in this area is a flood protection infrastructure that is on a scale our city has never seen before. This is 290 hectares inside the pink square and is designed to protect the city from the lower portion of this river, which is the downstream part of the Don River. It's 365 square kilometer watershed that drains into this pink bounded area. And what's interesting about this watershed is it's the largest urbanized watershed in the country. So there's a lot of detritus and contamination that is coming down this watershed into the river area, and it can flood in a flash storm quite severely. So this is what the area looks like now. It is a post-industrial area. It's been quiet, you might say, economically for the last 30 years. And it's slowly being rebooted economically by new industries and mostly by a major change to the river, which is going to cut through it. In fact, just before I arrived in Sweden, we had the official opening of what's called Portland's 2024. And these are our politicians, our local councillors at the city level, our provincial and federal politicians breaking ground for what will become a new island, a home to between 70 and 90,000 people, depending on the date you choose. And it will also move about 1.4 million cubic meters of soil. It's going to excavate from these areas to create a new lake, or a new river rather. And in doing so, will allow the river to divert away from a more built-up portion of the city and therefore protect from flood. So it's one of the largest earth-moving works projects in recent history, certainly in modern history, I would say, meaning in this century. And flood risk to the lower city will be considerably ameliorated. You can see what the flood risk modeling looks like. The idea is to prevent that from happening. What's exciting about it is that it's a green infrastructure project. It's a new river. And one has to ask the question, how do we design for a new river that is intended to look and feel like a river, but must be armored in an engineering way? It doesn't look like a Dutch dike. It doesn't look like a ship channel. It looks like a real river. And it has no less than 6 major parks created around it, but there isn't a single residence yet. There are no homes here. There are no people living in the area. And this is why we say this is an experiment in leading with landscape. This is an area of the city that will be defined by the river, rather than having the river subsumed and defined by the city, which has been our traditional approach to doing things. And certainly most European cities, we have rivers that are constrained and defined by their cities, not the reverse. This is an artist's rendering from MVVA. Michael van Valkenburg and Associates are the landscape architectural firm. And of course, there are a number of hydrologists. As you might imagine, this is a major hydrological engineering challenge. It's also a form of interesting to make this river look natural is challenging. So it combines a number of different areas of expertise in doing so. So the investment potential here is principally in flood protection, but the benefits on top of that $1.25 billion investment are enormous, with 6 new parks, 4 schools, and a community of, let's say, approximately at the low end 70,000 people. We have systems ecologies that have to be considered, in addition to the standard hydrological engineering, which actually is not standard because the river doesn't look like a channel anymore. We also have many layers of human program that will go into this for recreation, cultural diversity, non-traditional sports fields, and most importantly, from my perspective, an accommodation of new urban biodiversity in these parks. They'll be designed very differently from our traditional parks by virtue of the river. And of course, the urban massing around this, which you'll see in a minute, is rather substantial. It's meant that this project also was led by landscape architects, not by architects. So landscape architects here are forming, they're giving form to a new community. Typically we have architects that give form to a community, and the architecture will work with the landscape. It's not to say that they're not involved, but we begin the investment in green infrastructure with the landscape itself. And the images are projective. They're meant to show our population, our citizens, What is coming? How will we use these places? What will be the range of possibility? To date, we don't typically see downtown major urban centers with canoeing in them, for example, or kayaking, or turtles necessarily. And the parks that are planned are multifunctional. They're planned as stormwater retention, wetland soaking and holding, with levees to protect from flooding, but at the same time giving topography, an introduction of 12 meters of topography in an otherwise flat landscape. 12 meters to allow for vistas, promontory viewing, walking, and of course, flood protection. So these, again, are multifunctional. And you can see from the sections, what's interesting from a design perspective is we've included ecological science, hydrological information, bathymetric data, so bathymetry of how deep the water is, to show a landscape below the surface of the water. We rarely see landscapes, aquascapes, as part of our city planning. And when you see the gradients here, you can understand how these shores are being naturally armored as well as armored with traditional engineering. But the image that most citizens care about is this one. What can I do there? What will this $1.25 billion get for us? And when they are projective, they're also suggesting what's possible. But they're meant to inspire an investment, but also to excite people to come to this area before it's complete. So these images do double duty, maybe triple duty, you might say. And of course, the lake is still functioning as a shipping channel. You can see in this image, we're reminded of the industrial past, but also the commercial present of the lake. It's not disappeared into memory. Some of these gradient habitats are of interest if you're in landscape architecture or aquatic ecology, because again, they're taking place in a city center. This is not a nature preserve, it's an active part of the city center. And in our schematic design schemes that we're reviewing right now, we can see how these will eventually take form and shape and give rise to the images, the projective representations that you see here. And you're looking here in this image, which is, of course, 8 years out. You can see a heritage building in the foreground, the soy mills, and then you can also see buildings that don't yet exist on the left-hand side of the screen. So from a representation point of view, the images challenge us, but they also prescribe, which maybe has some interesting social questions about how we use them. They're also intended, of course, to be seasonal. These images are capturing our full 4 seasons, as you also enjoy in Stockholm. And most importantly, they don't just get shown in the summer. In all of the images, we see active transportation, people moving in ways that are not car dependent, which is one of the key missions of Waterfront Toronto, the organization that will stitch together and oversee these landscapes. And when the building massing is added, there will, of course, be road and rail connections, but you can see they're minimized given the massing sizes projected here. Those are double LRT lines, as well as 6 bridges that will connect this new island to the downtown city core. So what about connection? The linkages and the connections between these new spectacular areas of capital investment are critical. These can't be gentrified islands. The $1.25 billion investment cannot be only for citizens who don't yet live here. It has to be for the whole city. And when we think about the connections to the regional network and to urban biodiversity, we have to give safe passage, place to move for everyone, from a young age of children to our senior citizens, as well as wildlife. And that's a tall challenge. It's a big order to do this. We think about how we're encouraging people to move around by bicycle. This is certainly a growing mode of transportation in the city, but it's not yet a safe one particularly. This image is rather idyllic. It's on the islands in front of the city. It's not in the city core itself. But like Stockholm and other northern cities, we do have days where it's possible to skate recreationally. And we're looking at exploring connections between some of our more interesting parks that have made use of desolate and derelict areas. This area under an expressway that has been turned into a skating trail. Our capital city of Ottawa has an 11-kilometer active trail for skating where people are actively using it to get from one place to the other, in the same way that Stockholmers used to. I say used to because I don't know how many days the archipelago now freezes, but in your historical imagery we see lots of people moving between the islands by skating. We don't know whether that is still possible under our changing climate. We hope that this is possible. It certainly adds to the robust ways of connecting through our city. We're even imagining multi-layered parks that make use of our gray infrastructure. another billion-dollar investment projected for the downtown core, where we have no possibility of at-grade park space. In high-density urban areas around the world, we're challenged to make new surfaces for parklands. So we might think about green roof approaches that are low to the ground. In other words, an at-grade park being built over a rail tunnel. This is a proposal for Rail Deck Park in the city of Toronto, not unlike Hudson Yards in New York City. But above all, we think about ways to move as being much more diverse, getting out of the car and allowing our streets to do double and triple duty, investing in a green infrastructure that allows for people of all types of mobility, as well as green vegetation and habitat cover, whether it's for birds along our North American flyway from the river or the lakefront to the river, or for casual strolling around the city. And these images, of course, are taken from many cities, but it's an inspirational reminder to our city planners that we need these kinds of multifunctional trails. Tourinscapes examples in China are renowned for their both functionality and their beauty. Boardwalk trails across wetlands that are now major urban parks designed to filter, slow, and hold water. But also poetic examples of how derelict areas can be given new life. Boardwalks don't need to be straight. People enjoy them when they're curvilinear. And when they are straight, these rails are often trail conversions, as in the example of Südgelände Park here in Berlin. There are lots of places from which we've drawn examples to thicken our streets and trails. That is to say, to make the possibility of diversity more robust, not just for walking, but for playing, stopping, enjoying. Our green streets in Toronto are intended to do this. Some of them are as yet untested. We don't know how well the bioretention planters and green medians will do. Our city doesn't yet have a mechanism to approve green medians in the same way that Amsterdam does, for example. But we're trying. We're testing in a place that has this big investment. On the waterfront in the Villiers Island community, we're looking at pollination gardens, bioswales, all of these multifunctional planting infrastructures that are also about water holding need to be part of our streets. They need to take away a lane from the automobile and give over to the capacity for slowing, holding, and greening. This right now is what our roadway looks like on the east side of the Don River heading towards the lake. You can see the segregation between oil and, well, you can't see the oil and gas, but it's here on the right-hand side. There's a walking trail along the water, oil and gas pipelines that are buried, a rail line, and an arterial road. And what you can't see on the other side is a much larger roadway. None of them are connected for reasons of safety. This is the old method of separation, segregation, removal of people. And now we think about how to reintegrate the road, burying the service lines deeper and removing some of the road-based commuter possibilities and introducing active transportation, habitat possibilities. And you can see in the lower image completed by my students in a studio, this is intended to show multifunctional possibility for habitat. But of course, all of this has to fit in a limited range. We have a limited width for streets. So how much more can we make that work for us? Can we understand the street as a kind of leading with landscape investment? We can, if we are prepared to reduce car traffic, particularly with the growing emphasis on public transit in the city, never an easy solution, always contentious, mostly by car owners. But also the question of autonomous vehicles, whether they will be many autonomous vehicles put together in a chain, which to me I think is called a train, or whether they will be individually and privately owned, we don't know. But we have to rethink the way the street works, and that's what these cross-sections are intended to do, shrinking the lane widths, moving some of the traffic off the road and giving over that space to a much richer, more diverse opportunity. And these are not, of course, all native plants. They have to be hardy, they have to withstand our salt treatment in the winter, they have to withstand the treatment of, or rather the addition of combustion byproducts from the cars that are still there, even if they're autonomous. We don't know what fuel they're using. Hopefully they're electric, we don't know. But these images are designed to give you some sense of what's being planned for these new communities with different sized streets, but always with a separated cycle path, which in our city is very unusual. That's a new concept. While in many European cities it may be standard, we're thinking of how do we use our cycle paths in a separated way from traffic to also serve as bioretention swales. Can we, again, do double or triple duty? Can we use that surface using a relatively simple and known technology of bioretention at below grade? Sometimes they will be part of the median, as shown in this section. Other times these catch basins will be connected to planters adjacent to cycle paths. Sometimes the material of the cycle path will be porous. Again, these are untested in our communities, tested in many places individually, but they're being combined here and scaled up as a kind of networked linkage. So this is where the streets will go, highlighted on this diagram that I've just shown you. Again, fitting within the framework of the green park and river system. Another opportunity we have for connections and linkages is the repurposing of old infrastructures, something that we may see more of in European cities, where you have to necessarily make and remake your landscape surfaces as times change and as needs must. The Meadowway is a new project, but on an old infrastructure. It is a new name for a hydro corridor by any other name. The hydro corridor connects 4 ravines, 13 parks, 20 kilometers of trails, 34 neighborhoods, 500 acres, if you want to convert to acres, and more than 1,000 species of flora and fauna. Most of all, insects for pollination. Some of the ground nesting bees in Toronto are quite rare regionally, and our urban areas are known to host species of local importance, particularly for pollination. And we find that when we talk about pollination, it sounds very scientific, but when we show images of plants in motion with children in the gardens that back onto this hydro corridor, we get a very different image for how we might project a future for this repurposed infrastructure. The hydro corridor looks like this. It already has some trails in it. What's most important about its investment is that it's a public and private partnership, which for us in Toronto is, again, unusual. It's a departure from the norm. We're becoming less and less of a socially supported welfare system and more of a public-private collection of operations. In this case, a charitable trust gave money to the city to partner with them, with the regional government, to turn this hydro corridor into active park space, not just for moving people, but also for biodiversity. And what's interesting is it travels through some of our city's most vulnerable neighborhoods. So marginalized communities with poorer people, lower education rates, and frankly, people who have very little access to nature and the outdoors. So this is an important social project as much as it is an ecological project. You can see by the image here, we have our students in my lab modeling, is it really a continuous linear park, or are we really talking about a pathway that has a number of fragments and cuts within it? And the reality is there are 32 arterial roads and streets that cut through this park. We can't really say that it's a safe passage or connection for wildlife and people yet. We have work to do. We can show it as a green line on a map or a yellow line, but the reality is it's interrupted. We need to find ways in this 16-kilometer linear park to make it safe for people and wildlife to move. Otherwise, we don't fulfill our mandate of connection. You can see how important it is, though, on this image, I hope. The Meadowway, or the 16-kilometer linear park, otherwise known as a hydro corridor, transverses between these green ravines on the map. And that makes it a very important east-west connector. So it's worthy of investment, both ecologically and socially. That brings me to the final section of thinking about leading with landscape, which is really scaling up to the region. We can't invest without a connection to the region. Otherwise, these become fragmented and isolated islands of green wealth. They're inevitably going to gentrify. We know that wherever we have built parks first, housing prices go up. The Waterfront is a terrific example where we have the most money spent in the city's history on parks being spent along the waterfront for tourists as destination parks and for people who don't yet live there. Meanwhile, in the back end of the city, behind in the north, we have decaying parks, parks that are underserviced, and in neighborhoods that have little access to green, which is why we need this regional approach. We also need it for the movement of wildlife from riverfront to lakefront and up into the ravines. And that's because Toronto is a ravine city. What does it mean to be a ravine city? Well, here's an expressway that runs through one of them. But these are deep folds within the landscape In this map, you can't really see the relief. Toronto looks very much like a flat city, but it's actually because of the glaciated nature of our city means that the river's cut down. And so the city may look flat from an airplane, but standing at grade, we have these deep folds hidden in plain sight, which are called our ravines. And this map gives you a sense of their connectedness, their trails. Three major rivers from west to east, the Humber, the Don, and the Rouge. And the stream systems that they connect carry water from the headwaters to the lakes. A very important water-based system in these watersheds. But they've historically washed out in storms. They've been hazardous. And in fact, in 1954, Hurricane Hazel resulted in a number of deaths in the city, washing out all of the major bridges across these ravines and compelled the city to protect them. That doesn't mean that doesn't still happen. In 2005, the remnants of Hurricane Katrina from New Orleans landed in Toronto as a tropical storm, and we had more than 4 viaducts and bridges wash out, reminding us that the landscape is always there. Even if we don't see it and we don't read it, it's always there. And you can see the tangle of human-made gray infrastructure still hangs there in that image to the left, but the river is moving. The river is always moving underneath. So this compels us to think about landscape infrastructure, again, as worthy of our capital investment, just as the pipelines you see there. So to prevent that lower flooding that you see on the right side of the image, and we've seen 3 record storms in 4 years, 2 in 1 year between 2016 and 2018, actually 2014 and 2018. We had 2 in 2013. This really is part of the major investment in protecting these ravines from development and ensuring that they are robust contributions to the landscape network. The profile looks like this when I said we're a city of a folded landscape. They dig down sometimes, up to 50 meters in places, and you have nice views down into the ravines, which can be very secretive, quiet places to walk. They're also places for urban wildlife, some of which is very common. Sometimes it wanders and we see wildlife in our major streets. Again, not unfamiliar in Stockholm. You sometimes see wildlife regularly on the outskirts and in the wedges. But these are very compelling images of the ravines worthy of investment, I think, to show you how the extent, a flyover image maybe gives a better sense that this is 17% of the total area of the city, of a downtown area of almost 3 million people. And at 17,000 hectares, we would argue that this is a huge park network that's hidden in plain sight. It's not recognized as a park, but with a policy structure, regionally, it's now being called a park system. So 3 major rivers, 1 Great Lake, 10 million trees. That's doing some serious carbon sequestration as well as urban biodiversity. So our strategy, which came into effect this year, is really about justifying the capital investment in the protection of the ravines as well as the addition of these new parks I spoke about. It's also about celebration, the celebration of place and a landscape identity that is meaningful to people. I spoke earlier on at the beginning of this lecture about the importance of a landscape identity or the recognition of how cities connect to their places, the places that sustain them. And for Torontonians, whether they be newly arrived or not, the ravines are often a gateway to the landscape that defines the city. And these are all recent examples of how people have talked about the ravines as an effort to invest in protecting them. I like this particular image described as the physical soul of the city, under the bridges, in the secret underbelly of the city. They're not well marked or well signed. They need an extensive connections to their trails. Some are very vernacular. They really don't have a lot of capital investment, and they may not need it. They simply need to be signed and connected. My students in our lab for the last 5 years have been doing research on these ravines in terms of how close they are to public transit, how close they are to walking, where neighborhoods need the most investment in signage and wayfinding, how people can benefit by being pointed to a ravine area that is available to them but they may not even know about. In other cases, we've looked at areas where improved connections need a portion of the capital investment. So rather than just piling money into the glamorous waterfront parks, we are asking the city with this research to distribute that investment to the areas in highest need, both in terms of biodiversity and cultural diversity and cultural need. Some of the images that we've been working on to design the edges of the ravines are to see them less as a channel for stormwater and more as an accessible gradient for people walking, biking, and moving, not just on a pathway at surface. They're also home to a number of our rare and endangered species, particularly the areas in orange are areas that are designated environmentally significant. And you can see that almost 58% of any wildlife you're going to find, particularly around migrating birds, are going to be seen in the ravines, as well as your best chance, your really only chance of coming across our reptiles and amphibians. Historically, they're important to us, and that's another reason that we think of these projections as also reflections of our past, the connection to the city's use of its parks, old trails for skating, some of which may never freeze again, but we've replaced with artificial rinks, and of course flooding, which is part and parcel of what it is to be in Don River Valley Park. Part of our strategy has been to rename these places, give them names that inject fresh inspiration and celebration, and of course, sometimes kick-starting a conversation about what is already hidden in plain sight that can be capitalized upon. All of the ravines that I've spoken about, the linkages and the trail connections, and the waterfront here connect into the city's hinterland, much like Stockholm's green wedges connect into your peri-urban areas for amenity landscapes of enjoyment, skiing and picnicking, hiking, canoeing, and so on. This area is also food production, as you would also recognize. 1.8 million acres of greenbelt. It's 800,000 hectares now. This is an area around the city that feeds into this ravine connection. And it's even been created in an artistic sculpture in the downtown core to remind people where their water comes from, where their food is connected. These linear connections of the ravines are not just trails for walking, but also connections for flows of food and water. It's also given rise to a conversation about whether parks can be blue. Does our inner harbor, much like Stockholm's archipelago, is it worthy to call it a park? It's for recreation, for fishing, for enjoyment, and also part of your landscape identity. So we think of the harbor here as a new park that is, again, hidden, waiting to be named, recognized, and invested in. And we use these water courses for movement, not just of goods, but of people, of fish, of birds. And they can be so much more than what we've done in the past, which is to relegate the water to a drain. That's the way we used to think of infrastructure. And this is the way we now think of infrastructure. So I hope that what I've talked about today is an example of how we can, with strategic investment, think about leading with landscape. Leading in our architecture as much as our policies and planning, as much as with our engineers and our communities. And that's really what I mean to say by invest in green infrastructure. You can read more about the work we do at the Ecological Design Lab, and I hope that we would have time for some discussion and questions now. Thank you.